I've got with me two portable gaming PC devices, Steam Deck competitors. We've got the Neo Air and the Neo Air Pro. Now, at a glance, they certainly do look identical, but there's some key differences worth highlighting. And the one thing I want to emphasize right out of the gate is that if you're interested in this device, just get the Pro model. It's just performance-wise significantly better with not much in the way of compromises, though price-wise it is a heftier premium. Now, what's particularly special about these devices is how small they are. You'll see that they're comparable to the Nintendo Switch Lite. I'll compare with devices like the Switch and the Steam Deck in a bit, but this is the smallest, the lightest of this kind of device that I've used, and there's a surprising amount of power in the Pro model for its size. So I'm excited to talk about all that. Let's dive right in. Now, when it comes to the unboxing experience, I've got to say the packaging felt pretty premium. It almost felt like I was unboxing an Apple product. Lots of foam inside for protection, and I also got this extra box with some goodies inside, most prominently this officially branded case made by company TomTalk, where the device fits in nice and snugly. And once you get the device out of the box, I think many of you will be surprised by how small these two devices are. Now, the main difference between these two in terms of size is the fact that the Pro, you can see right here, is noticeably thicker, sort of in the middle, whereas the regular Air is significantly thinner. And also, the Pro is a little bit heavier. I'll be honest with you, holding both of them, it's not a huge difference. It's not enough of a difference for me to say that the Air is worth it over the Pro. If you want more exact measurements, both the Air and the Air Pro are 8 and 14 over 16 inches wide, 3.5 inches tall, and at their thickest point, both of these devices are 1 and 1/8 inches thick, but the thinnest point is where they differ. The Neo Air at its thinnest point is 3/4 inches thick, and the Neo Air Pro at its thinnest point is 7/8 inches thick. So that's kind of the main difference, but when you think about it, because the thickest point is the same for both devices, the only real difference is that the grip back here is less prominent on the Air Pro because the extra thickness kind of consumes more of that grip, but it's still grippy enough back here where I don't feel like it really makes a huge difference. Like, you can tell the difference that this is a more prominent grip, but this grip is plenty, especially because this device is so lightweight, so I really don't deem that to be enough of a compromise. Now, with that out of the way, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to take the Air out of the equation here and just focus on the Pro because this is absolutely the model I would get if I had to pick one or the other. Now, let's bring in the Switch Lite here, and you can see that length and height-wise, it's really pretty similar. The screen size is the same. Both are 5.5 inches. Obviously, the Neo Air Pro is a thicker device. And yeah, the Neo Air is more comparable to the Switch Lite, but it's still noticeably thicker. But again, the Pro, because the thickest point is the same as the regular Air, might as well get this one because it's not going to take up more space in your bag or in a case than the Neo Air would. The Switch Lite is definitely thinner and lighter, but I mean, this is still pretty compact for the kind of power that it has, and I'll get to performance metrics in a bit. Now let's put aside the Switch Lite and bring in a chunkier device, the also popular Steam Deck, its main competition, and this is the main advantage that the Neo Air Pro has over the Steam Deck. It's just so much smaller, so much more compact, and noticeably lighter in weight. And you can see right here when I put this on top of the Steam Deck just how much more surface area the Steam Deck takes up. And thickness-wise, they are about the same, but this is just an easier device to fit in your bag, and it is easier to just carry around. Of course, the Steam Deck just has more functionalities, and it is overall more powerful, but do not underestimate the power of the Neo Air Pro. I was surprised by how capable this little device was for its size. Now, in terms of exact weight, the Neo Air Pro is 1.014 pounds versus the Steam Deck's 1.475 pounds, or 460 grams versus 669 grams. And then the Neo Air, the lighter version, the lighter model, is 410 grams versus the 460 here. Again, it doesn't make that much of a difference. It's 0.9 pounds versus 1 pound. So let's put the Steam Deck aside for now now bring in the Air real quick just for specs comparison. I'm going to just put that up on the screen, but basically the main difference between these two models is that the Pro has a better CPU and GPU, a higher range of TDP to draw the most power out of the chips, and a bigger battery. As for how the device overall feels to hold and how the buttons and everything feels to handle, this is a really comfortable device. The grips are definitely nowhere near as prominent as a Steam Deck's. It's more of a bump for your 3 fingers back here to latch onto, but because the device is so compact, lightweight, it's honestly more than enough for comfortable gaming to have that purchase that your fingers can wrap around just to add that extra level of grip. This is quite comfortable to hold. As for the inputs here, we've got the analog sticks, which basically feel comparable to the Nintendo Switch's analog sticks. They're like a little stiffer, maybe. These analog sticks definitely have less range of motion than other portable PC gaming devices I've used. It's definitely no Steam Deck on that front, which straight up just feel like full-fledged analog sticks. With these, it's hard to make minor adjustments. You can also, of course, press down on the analog sticks. These are nice and tactile. You've got the D-pad and the face buttons here. I've got to say, while these are functional, I do think that they're a bit too pronounced. I do think that the travel distance for these buttons are a bit too much, where your fingers really have to sink in quite a bit in order for the button press to happen. And you can hear how chonky and stiff these buttons are to press. Compare that to the Nintendo Switch here, or the Switch Lite. They sound so much lighter, and the buttons are just less pronounced, which allows for just what feels like more responsive button presses. And so if you want to like mash the button, for example, you can do that really comfortably on the Nintendo Switch Lite, whereas on the Ayaneo Air Pro, it's because of the stiffness and the travel distance, it's just a bit more fatiguing to press these buttons. And not just when you're mashing it, just in general, I do feel like it should have just been, the buttons should have been sunken into the device a bit more, and it should be a little less stiff for an extra layer of comfort, but these are not, unmanageable by any means. I also wish that the top of these face buttons were rounded off, because I find myself, like, if I want to transition from, say, pressing the A button to pressing the B button, sometimes I find that my thumb gets stuck as I'm trying to, like, press the button like that, whereas on the Switch Lite, because the buttons are rounded off at the top and it's not too risen in terms of its height, you can very easily just like press the various buttons around the one that you already have held down, and you don't feel your fingers ever getting stuck on any one button. As for the shoulder and trigger buttons, they're both nice and tactile to press. The trigger buttons in particular, I'm impressed by. They have a good amount of range. They are nice and resistant, so you can make fine adjustments during analog trigger presses, and it just feels nice and smooth, no friction between the button and the interior plastic. The shoulder buttons are nice to press, but I do find them to be a little unresponsive, in the sense that if you don't press the button down hard enough, even though it does recess, you'll find that the input doesn't register. So let me show you what I mean. Right here we have Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker running on a PlayStation Portable emulator, and I have the aiming mapped to the shoulder button right here. Now you can see I'm pressing the button like so, but nothing's happening because I'm not pressing it hard enough. Even though the button does recess, I have to squeeze it a little more for the aiming to happen. You do eventually get used to how much you have to squeeze that button. You don't have to press super hard. It's just that sometimes I want to press lightly, but nothing will happen when I do so. And that goes for both left and right, and so that makes these shoulder buttons less refined compared to the other devices that I've used. Overall, though, the inputs are very functional, not the best I've used, but more than enough for your gaming needs. Then on the bottom left, we have the start and select buttons. I do not like the placement here. I like my start and select buttons to be here, or even down here, but the two kind of grouped together as one. I don't like this placement, but these are nice and easy to press. Overall, it just feels like one button, and you have to press one side more than the other to differentiate between start and select. Now, something cool about this device is that it has a number of customizable buttons. So in front of these shoulder buttons, there are actually two more buttons, and these you can map to a variety of shortcuts, and then this button right here is also another shortcut button. And so right here you can see that when I hold down this button, the task manager pops up, and I can bring that up right there. If I press it once, the keyboard shows up. If I hold this down, you got the task view, and then this, just pressing it without holding it, that's escape. And then this button is show desktop. So if I open a program right here, boom, that'll take me to desktop. And then last but not least, we have the Aya button here. If you press it, it'll bring up the quick tool. You can set the volume here. You can set the brightness as well. And then below that, you've got various TDP toggles. You can switch between 5 watts, 8 watts, 12 watts, and then a custom one you set to whatever you want. I set it to the maximum 18 watts. You can also click on this button to cycle between various fan profiles. So I've set it to wild. And then to the left of that, you've got glanceable information when it comes to the percentage of CPU and GPU power that's being used up, and then the fan RPM. Up here, we got some customizable shortcuts to commonly used apps, and then down here, we have shortcuts to various commands and settings. So this is escape, and then right here we have the ability to toggle the mouse on or off, and then you've got other shortcuts that you can apply to it. You got Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and this toolbar can be customized in what's known as the Aya space, which you can access by holding down the Aya button instead of pressing it. This is essentially a sort of custom interface that makes it seem more like a console experience, where you can just cycle through your games here in the game section, and then in the assistant portion of this interface, you can check out things like stats on CPU, GPU, and fan usage. It'll show you how much storage space you have in your SSD, the fan speed, and then the battery life. You can back out of that and then go down here to get hardware information. This is basically the system specs. Backing out, you can right here see some of the software you have installed on your PC, and you can access them from here. And then here is the master controller menu. Not only does it show you a 3D model of the device that you can rotate as you wish, on the left here, you can customize things like the sensitivity of the joystick and the joystick zone, the sensitivity of the triggers. You can customize continuous button presses, basically turbo mode, I believe, which you can turn on for any of the inputs and buttons on the device. You can switch the ABXY model to be more like Xbox, where it's ABXY, or to be more like Nintendo, where it's ABXY. Below that, you've got settings for rumble. The rumble on this thing is not impressive. It feels like a smartphone vibration, so it's not all that effective. I prefer to turn it off. And then last but not least, we've got settings for the included gyroscope. Though I couldn't get this to work, I can turn it on here and then make it so that one of the buttons, in this case left trigger, triggers the gyroscope, but trying to use it in game, it just wouldn't work, so I probably have to find like third-party solutions or look through guides. It's a stark contrast to the Steam Deck, where the software surrounding the gyroscopic controls are so well implemented within Steam itself. Backing out of the master controller menu, you've got the Configure Aya Neo section, where you can do things like calibrate your analog sticks. You can set the custom buttons commands right here to whatever you want. Backing out, you can also do the same for the custom button on the bottom right here. Set it to whatever your preference is. And you can enable even more shortcuts on the top right here, where you can turn on the ability to hold down the right trigger and shoulder buttons and then press one of the D-pad buttons for various commands. Now you can't customize these. These are preset, and the way it's set by default, by holding these two buttons down and pressing the up D-pad, you'll bring up the keyboard. Pressing left will bring up multitasking. Pressing down will bring up the task manager. And pressing right will allow you to take a screenshot. Backing out again, you can toggle the back of the device, and this is where you can set your custom TDP. I set it to 18, but you can set it to whatever you want, whatever your preference is. Backing out completely again, below the Configure Aya Neo menu, you've got the screenshot book, where you can see all the screenshots you took through the Aya Neo interface. Through, if you customize one of the buttons to take a screenshot, this is where they'll show up. And then finally, we got shortcuts right here, the customizable ones that I detailed, everything from bringing up the start menu, bringing up the keyboard, enabling or disabling the mouse, muting, escape, among many others that you can set to your preference. When you bring up the toolbar here, you can access those relatively efficiently. So yeah, this is very handy to have. All the software and the overlay and the Quicktools and everything isn't anywhere near as refined as the Steam Deck stuff. This still feels like beta software. It's still nice to have some of these functionalities that are lacking in, say, the One X player devices. It's also worth noting that this overlay here is not quite an overlay. It depends on the software, but if it's not borderless full screen, then there is a chance that bringing this up might minimize the software or that the overlay just won't overlay on top of the game that you're playing and whatnot. So it's a minor inconvenience, but still being able to bring this up and change the TDP on the fly, the brightness, the volume, and all these things, it's definitely a welcome feature. And then last but not least for buttons, we've got the volume rocker right here. Nice and clicky, easy to press. And then finally the power button, which has a fingerprint scanner. You can see right here, I can just put my index finger on the fingerprint reader and boom, I'm already signed in just like that. Now this power button, it feels nice and clicky to press, but these edges, I don't know if you can see the chrome right there. If you scroll your finger through it like that, you can feel this sharp edge that, especially on this side, it almost feels like it could cut you. And I am not a fan of that. Sometimes when you're searching for the power button and you're dragging your finger around the top, you just get the feeling that something's scraping against the skin of your finger. It's not a comfortable feeling, so I wish it could have smoothed that out. All right, so that's it for inputs. Let's take a look at the outputs, like the screen here, which is 5.5 inches. It's OLED, and it's nice and vibrant. It looks awesome. No backlight bleed. The blacks are deep. The colors pop. It's just a far better screen than the Steam Decks. Now, the smaller sized screen does mean that for certain games, 5.5 inches might be a little too small. You really have to really hold the device up front and close and personal to be able to see the smaller text or see some of the smaller assets in game. This is also 1080p, which I think is overkill. I immediately just went to display settings and set it to 720p. That's more than enough for a screen of this size. That's just 5.5 inches. And to get the most performance out of this device, you're going to want to stick to 720p. So yeah, just an awesome OLED device. I wish it was a little bigger. I wish it would have expanded the screen to fit the bezels here. That would have made it the perfect size, but this is still good enough for the most part, save for a few games where it might just be a bit too small. As for the ports on this device, you've got a USB-C at the bottom, as well as a 3.5mm headphone jack and a microSD card slot. And then on the top, you've got one more USB-C port. I think all of these devices should have two USB ports to charge the device, one at the top, one at the bottom. That way you can pick where you want to place the charging cable. You can also charge the device while having a USB-C free and open for whatever other external device. But yeah, overall, this is a very solid feeling device. It's got a nice weight to it. It feels dense. It feels premium. It's definitely plastic, but it doesn't feel cheap. And it's comfortable overall. If the buttons were less stiff and the shoulder buttons were less prone to missed inputs, this would have been perfect. Also, the analog sticks I wish had a bit more range of motion, but on a device this small, you can only do so much. All right, so that finally brings us to performance, starting with PC games, all of them running at 1280 by 720 resolution, 720p. Hades runs like a dream on both the Air and the Air Pro. On the Air Pro, the frame rate never dipped below 200 frames per second, usually stayed in the low to mid 200s. On the regular Air, we were still looking at performance that was above 100 frames per second. Dark Souls Remastered runs fantastic on both the Air and the Air Pro, 60 frames per second, flawless, max settings. Batman Arkham Origins, here's where we can start to notice some of the performance differences. The Air Pro can run the game with DX11 enhancements on at 60 frames per second with just some dips into 50s. For the regular Air to achieve that, you have to turn off all the DirectX 11 enhancements off, and that way it stays at a mostly 60 FPS average with a few minor dips here and there. And with the Air Pro, if you turn off DX11 enhancements, it stays at a consistent 60 FPS, no dips whatsoever. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is also another game where you can notice the performance differences. Running on the Air Pro, it's almost always sitting at 60 frames per second, max settings. On the Air, on the other hand, we're looking at an average of 40 to 45 frames per second. It's noticeably less smooth. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. This is such a well-optimized game on PC. On the Air Pro, consistent 60 frames per second, high settings. And we're talking about a device that isn't much bigger than a Switch Lite that's able to play Metal Gear Solid 5 at high settings at a smooth 60 FPS. I mean, talk about a true portable ops. And it also performs fairly well on the regular Air, 50 to 60 frames per second average at medium to high settings, whereas on the Air Pro at all high settings, we can get consistent 60 FPS. The Witcher 3 on the Air Pro, we're looking at 45 frames per second-ish average at medium settings, whereas on the regular Air, the same settings yield 35 frames per second-ish average. On the Air Pro, you can actually get to medium to high settings and still maintain 40 frames per second-ish average. So again, a noticeable performance difference. Control on the Air Pro, 40 to 50 frames per second average on low settings. On the regular Air, 30 to 40 frames per second average, low settings, and occasional dips into the high 20s. Still playable, but on the Air Pro, it just feels so much smoother. Death Stranding, this is one game that I wouldn't play on the regular Air because even on low settings with Fidelity FX on, the game does dip below 30 frames per second frequently enough that overall it felt like a stuttery experience. Playable, I suppose, but just it's not the ideal way to play this game. On the Air Pro, on the other hand, even on high settings, I could achieve 35 to 40 frames per second average with Fidelity FX on. I just decided to turn the game down to low settings because on the smaller screen, you really cannot tell much of a difference between the various graphic settings. And with Fidelity FX on low settings, I was getting 40 to 50 frames per second average, and it looked great on this screen. Outer Wilds on the Air Pro, 30 to 50 frames per second, high settings with shadows turned down to medium, and if you turn down settings, you could get even better performance. On the regular Air, on the other hand, high settings with medium shadows yielded 25 to 45 frames per second, and turning everything down to medium settings with shadows on low, I got 30 to 50 frames per second. So still playable on the regular Air, but on the Air Pro, it's just a noticeably better running game. Tunic ran great on both devices, but on the Air, for some reason, if I turned on VSync, the frame rate would often dip below 60 frames per second and just be really stuttery and inconsistent, whereas turning VSync off would yield 70 frames per second average at max settings. I don't know what's going on there. On the Air Pro, though, the game runs even better with VSync off at max settings. We're looking at 90 frames per second versus the Air 70, and there's no VSync issues with this one. Turning VSync on the Air Pro yields a consistent 60 frames per second with no stutters. Resident Evil 3 Remake. There's a gorgeous game that runs super well on PC. On the Air Pro, 60 frames per second average, high settings with shadows set to medium, with Fidelity FX set to ultra quality. On the regular Air, on the other hand, still a playable 45 to 60 FPS average at high settings and medium shadows with Fidelity FX set to balanced, but it just runs that much smoother and more consistently on the Air Pro, and it looks a little better on the Air Pro to boot. Monster Hunter Rise. The Air Pro achieves 60 frames per second at high settings, medium shadows, and image quality set to 100%, turned down from the default 150. On the regular Air, same settings yielded 45 to 60 frames per second rather than a consistent 60 frames per second. Still playable, but the extra performance on the Air Pro is really nice. Cyberpunk 2077, that's a game that I wouldn't play on the regular Air. 25 to 40 frames per second average at low settings and Fidelity FX set to performance. It's stuttery enough where I wouldn't play this game on this device, whereas on the Air Pro, the same low settings and Fidelity FX set to performance yields 35 to 60 frames per second, depending on the part of the map you're in and what's happening on screen. I'd say around 45 to 55 frames per second average more often than not. Overall, just a very playable experience on the Air Pro. Elden Ring on the regular Air at low settings, 30 frames per second average with some fluctuations into the 20s and mid to high 30s. It's playable, if a bit stuttery. On the Air Pro, on the other hand, you can boost the settings to medium to high and still get 30 to 35 frames per second average. It's just noticeably smoother and with less stutters. Last but not least, Marvel Spider-Man. I wouldn't play this game on the Air because the frame rate was sitting at an average of 25 to 35 frames per second average on low settings. The frame rate tends to sit around 28 to 30 frames per second, but can sometimes dip into the 10s when web slinging through the city and you are high enough where you get to see a significant portion of the map. On the other hand, I wouldn't mind playing Marvel Spider-Man on the Air Pro because the game runs at a 35 to 45 frames per second average on low settings, AMD FSR 2.0 set to 60 frames per second target. The frame rate tends to sit at 30 frames per second or above. It doesn't dip below 30 FPS often. The game's just noticeably less stuttery on the Pro than on the regular Air, and it really does make a world of difference in the fluidity of the gameplay. Those are the results I got when testing PC gaming on this device. Now for emulation. I started with PlayStation Portable Emulation, 3x native resolution, booted up Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, and on both the Air and the Air Pro, I was getting a consistent 60 frames per second with a 60 FPS mod. Citra, the 3DS emulator at 3x native resolution, I booted up Majora's Mask 3D, and on both the Air and Air Pro, consistent 30 frames per second, no issues. Next, PCSX2, the PlayStation 2 emulator, I set that to 3x native resolution. On the Air, Devil May Cry 3 actually struggled to run at a consistent 60 frames per second. I was getting 45 to 55 FPS average, but turning down the native resolution to 2x, resolve that. 2x native resolution when it comes to PS2, that's basically 720p, and for a screen of this size, again, more than enough. On the Air Pro, though, at 3x native resolution, getting consistent 60 FPS, no problem. Next up, we got Dolphin, the GameCube and Wii emulator set to 3x native resolution. Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes ran at a consistent 60 frames per second on the Air Pro, whereas on the Air, we're looking at mostly 60 FPS with some dips into 50s and 40s, but turning the native resolution to 2x saw the regular Air achieve a consistent 60 FPS. Same thing with Metroid Prime Trilogy, consistent 60 FPS on the Air Pro, whereas on the Air, 50 to 60 FPS average at 3x native resolution, and mostly consistent 60 FPS at 2x native resolution. Next up, Cemu for Wii U emulation. It ran fairly well on both the Air and the Air Pro. The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker ran at a consistent 30 FPS across both Air and Air Pro. Super Mario 3D World, consistent 60 FPS on both the Air and the Air Pro. Xenoblade Chronicles X, consistent 30 FPS on Air Pro, and mostly consistent 30 FPS on the Air. A few negligible dips into 28, 27 FPS here and there. Now, there is a significant difference in Zelda Breath of the Wild. On the Air Pro, we're looking at 30 to 45 frames per second average outdoors and 40 to 55 frames per second average indoors, whereas on the regular Air, frame rate was just, I would say, not playable. 20 to 25 frames per second outdoors and 30 to 40 frames per second indoors, but you spend so much time outdoors that sub 30 FPS is just not ideal for this game. So if Wii U emulation and Breath of the Wild emulation is important to you, the Air Pro is the one to get. And last but not least, Switch emulation, for which I used both Yuzu and Ryujinx because different games run better on different emulators. So I'm just going to share the performance for the emulator where a game ran best. With Mario Kart 8 on Yuzu, I was getting a consistent 60 frames per second average on the Air Pro, whereas on the regular Air, I was still getting solid performance, but 50 to 60 FPS average, occasional dips into the 50s. Zelda Link's Awakening on Yuzu. The Air Pro ran it at a consistent 60 frames per second, whereas the regular Air ran it at 50 to 60 frames per second, usually in the mid-50s, and the frame rate does zip into the mid-40s when cutting grass. The particle effects, I guess, must have an effect on that. And when the frame rate dips in Zelda Link's Awakening, the game speed also dips with it. Next up, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, which runs best on Ryujinx. On the Air Pro with a 60 FPS mod, I ran it at 45 to 60 frames per second. It was just such a smooth experience. On the regular Air, not so much. On Ryujinx, 20 to 30 frames per second average, often dipping below 30 FPS. And for some reason, Ryujinx is more prone to crashes on the regular Air versus the Air Pro. Now, Astro Chain is an interesting case where on Yuzu, the cutscenes play fine, the audio is all synced up, but the gameplay performance is worse than on Ryujinx, whereas on Ryujinx, the cutscenes tend to get off sync in terms of video and audio often. There tend to be slowdowns there, but during gameplay, it runs a lot more smoothly than on Yuzu. Gameplay is more important, so I'm going to prioritize Ryujinx, through which the Air Pro ran Astro Chain at a mostly consistent 30 frames per second, though with some dips into the low to mid-20s when going into scanning mode in visually busy areas. On the regular Air, on the other hand, yeah, not ideal performance, even on Ryujinx. Sub 30 FPS performance a lot of the times, and even sub 20 FPS performance in more visually busy areas. Same thing goes for Xenoblade Chronicles, which ran best on Ryujinx. On the Air Pro, was running at 40 to 50 frames per second average with the 60 FPS mod. Just smooth as butter, very little in the way of stutters. On the regular Air, on the other hand, mid-20s frames per second average. Playable, but just not smooth. And then last but not least, Super Mario Odyssey ran best on Ryujinx. The Air Pro would run this game perfectly. Consistent 60 FPS, nary a dip. On the regular Air, on the other hand, the game ran at 30 to 50 frames per second average, and this is also a case where the game speed is affected by the frames per second. So Mario Odyssey on the regular Air felt like it was running in slow motion a little bit. So yeah, there's just no denying that the Air Pro is the far better device when it comes to how games perform. This is just the one to get if you can afford it, and I'll get to pricing and value in a bit. Before we get to that, let's talk about thermals and fans. Both devices do get warm on the back, sort of towards the middle especially, but I will say that the Air does get noticeably hotter, and the warmth tends to spread to the grips more because it's just a more compact device. There's just more heat trapped in there. Whereas because the Air Pro is thicker, it's less prone to heating up as much, but it can still get noticeably warm on the back here, and the warmth can still bleed a little bit towards the grips. As for the fans, both the Air and the Air Pro have audible fans, but the Air in particular has this more annoying, high-pitched whirring sound, and you can actually feel the device vibrate with the fan speed, which is not the case for the thicker Air Pro here. The noise here is less of a high-pitched whir and more of like a high-pitched hum. It's just a less annoying fan noise on the Pro. Now, another major advantage that the Pro has is battery life, because the Air has a 28 watt-hour battery versus the Air Pro's 38 watt-hour battery. So at the max 15 watts TDP with max brightness, I was getting around an hour on the regular Air. Whereas if I turned everything down to 5 watts TDP and minimum brightness, I got about 2.5 hours on the regular Air. The Air Pro, on the other hand, with a 38 watt-hour battery, I was getting at 18 watts TDP and max brightness about an hour and 15 minutes, and setting everything down to minimum brightness and minimum 5 watt TDP, I was getting around 3.5 hours. Now, while the Air Pro is noticeably better in terms of battery life than the regular Air, it doesn't change the fact that the Air Pro's battery life is still nothing impressive and falls short of other devices like the Steam Deck. But keep in mind that this device is this much smaller than the Steam Deck, so yeah, there's going to be sacrifices in battery life, but it just diminishes the portability factor when this device that you get to carry around with you and is so light and compact only lasts an hour if you want to get the best performance from games, or if you're playing lighter games, only really lasts up to a little over 3 hours. Now, with the right battery bank, you can increase the battery life by quite a bit. So this battery bank that I got right here, for example, yielded an extra 3.5 hours of extra battery life with the 18 watt TDP setting. So that's about 4 hours and 45 minutes of intensive gaming. And if you lower the TDP to 5 watts for less intensive gaming, you're looking at pretty much all day battery if you're carrying this thing with you, which does compromise on the portability factor a little bit. Last but not least, let's talk about price and value. So right here I have the Air and the Air Pro. The Air here, this model, this spec, is $600 during the Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign, and it'll retail for $650. The Air Pro, while the better device, is definitely significantly more expensive. This comes in at $970 during the Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign and will retail for $1,100 according to their page. For comparison, again, the Steam Deck is $650 at its most expensive and $400 at its cheapest. So value-wise, the Steam Deck continues to triumph over all other competitors, and that's the main advantage that Steam Deck has, on top of the fact that it just runs a lot of PC games super well, better than all of the other devices out there. One area where the Steam Deck lacks, though, is Switch emulation. This thing, much smaller than the Steam Deck, and manages Switch emulation much better. And the fact that, again, this device, being so small, can still manage AAA gaming that's, reasonable in terms of performance and the kinds of settings you can get out of these AAA games, modern ones at that, makes this device very impressive indeed. And yes, you're paying a higher price for it, but man, this thing is it's so portable, and it's crazy to me that we've managed to come to a point where a device this small, that's about as big as a Switch Lite in terms of length and height, and that is, overall a smaller footprint than the regular Switch here, or the Switch OLED here, and is able to run games like Witcher 3 and at better looking settings and at better performance, makes this a very compelling proposition and a very compelling competitor to devices like the Steam Deck. This is definitely one of my favorite portable PC gaming devices I've used. I think the size to power ratio is amazing on this thing. The Steam Deck is still, I think, the better device, but I mean, when you consider, again, the size difference, it's really impressive what this thing can do. The Steam Deck still has more features, and its elements of its software is just better developed, and it runs games better, and it's much cheaper. But this is an alternative that I'm going to keep around, especially because emulation is handled so well, and for its size, it's perfect for emulation. And on top of that, AAA gaming is more than doable on this thing. So, yeah, man, technology, you guys. It's great to see all this competition. But yeah, there you have it, folks. That's my review of the Neo Air and the Neo Air Pro. Just get the Pro if you are considering this device, unless the price really is a major factor. Let me know in the comments below what your impressions are of the Neo and the Neo Air Pro based on the information I shared in this review. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.